The air at the Henderson Farm dispersal auction was thick with the smell of damp earth, diesel, and desperation. It was late October 1978, and a cold, spitting rain had turned the farmyard into a slick, muddy soup. Men stood in tight knots, hands shoved deep in their pockets, shoulders hunched inside worn canvas jackets. They weren't here for bargains. They were here to watch a neighbor's life get sold off piece by piece, a grim spectator sport in a time of uneasy prosperity. Jedediah Stone stood apart from the others, his back against the rough-sawn boards of a corn crib. At 34, he looked older. The sun and wind had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his hands were gnarled and stained with the kind of grease that soap and water couldn't touch. He wasn't here to gloat or to bargain. He was here because this was what farmers did. They bore witness. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, a hypnotic cadence of numbers and descriptions, echoed off the side of the big red barn. Got a John Deere 4020 fellas, a good runner, diesel, power shift. She's got a little smoke, but what old girl don't? Who'll give me 2,500, 25, 25, now 3,000. Thank you, sir. 3,000. Jed didn't even look. He couldn't afford a tractor like that, not even one with a tired engine. His own fleet was a museum of post-war iron, a dependable but tired Farmall M for planting and cultivating, and a gutsy old Oliver 1650 for the heavy tillage. He owned them outright, just like he owned his 120 acres. His father's words were branded into his soul. Debt is a chain, son. You don't see it, but you'll feel it when you try to run. The crowd shifted toward the back of the lot, where the odds and ends, the forgotten and the broken, waited for their final judgment. That's where Jed's eyes had been fixed all morning. Tucked behind a rusted-out gravity wagon and a set of harrows with missing teeth sat a hulking mass of faded yellow steel. It was an Alice Chalmers HD6 crawler, a bulldozer, probably from the late 1950s. It listed to one side, its tracks sunk deep into the mud like the bones of some prehistoric beast. A thick coat of rust bloomed on every flat surface, and the exhaust stack was uncovered, a gaping invitation for years of rain and snow. "All right, what am I bid on this fine piece of lawn art?" the auctioneer bellowed, a smirk playing on his lips. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. "The Alice Chalmers Dozer. Engines stuck tighter than a banker's fist, boys. We're selling it for scrap weight, where she sits. You haul it." He looked over at a burly man in greasy overalls. "What about it, Gus? You want it for the scrapyard?" Gus, the owner of the local salvage yard, spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the wet ground. "Nope, tracks are shot, blade pins are egged out, and God only knows what's wrong with that Detroit diesel. Cost me more in fuel to drag it back to the yard than I'd get for it. I wouldn't take it if you gave it to me." The auctioneer's face fell. A public rejection from the scrap man was a death sentence. No interest, not even for parts. $25. "Can I get 25? Silence. The only sound was the drumming of rain on the tin roof of the machine shed. Then a new voice cut through the quiet, slick and confident. "Might as well just dig a hole and bury that thing, Henderson. Save everyone the trouble." Frank Miller pushed his way to the front. He was everything Jed was not. Miller wore a clean seed corn cap, a new-looking Carhartt jacket, and boots that were muddy but not worn out. He farmed 1,000 acres, all of it with a line of credit from the bank that would choke a horse. His two new John Deere 4440s, with their air-conditioned Soundguard cabs, were the talk of the county. He was the future of farming, and he knew it. He looked at the Dozer, then at Jed, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. He saw Jed looking at the machine, and a sneer formed on his face. "Thinking of upgrading, Stone? That old Farmall of yours finally give up the ghost?" Jed's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He just kept his eyes on the Dozer. He could see past the rust and the neglect. He saw a Garwood blade, a heavy-duty winch on the back, and the unmistakable shape of a Detroit 371 engine under the hood. It was a simple, brutal machine from an era when things were built to last, not to be traded in every 3 years. $10, Jed said, his voice quiet but clear. The auctioneer's head snapped in his direction. "I got $10 from Jed Stone. $10. Is he crazy or does he know something we don't?" "Who'll give me 15? 15, the crowd murmured. Frank Miller laughed out loud, a harsh barking sound. $10. You'll spend 100 just on bolts to get that thing apart. What in God's name are you going to do with it, Jed? That's my business, Jed said, never taking his eyes off the auctioneer. Going once at $10, the auctioneer chanted, desperate to be rid of the thing. Going twice. Sold. For $10 to Jedediah Stone. Good luck to you, son. You're going to need it. The clerk scribbled on his notepad. Frank Miller just shook his head and walked away, clapping a neighbor on the back and saying, loud enough for Jed to hear, "Some men just don't know when they're beat. Farming in the past." Jed walked over to the clerk, pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, and handed over a $10 bill. It was crumpled and soft as cloth. As he took the receipt, he walked over to his purchase. He laid a hand on the cold, pitted steel of the blade. It was 10 tons of somebody else's failure, a monument to broken dreams and seized pistons. The rain ran in rusty rivers down its side. Everyone saw a pile of scrap. A fool's purchase, a $10 joke. But Jed saw something else. He saw potential, buried deep under the rust. He saw a tool that, if he could bring it back to life, could reshape his land and his future, without a single signature on a banker's loan document. He saw a way to fight back. Now, before we go any further, before we get into the grease and the grit of bringing this old beast back to life, I've got to ask you all something. What's the craziest, most hopeless project you've ever taken on? The one everyone told you was a lost cause, a waste of your time and money. Whether it was an old truck, a piece of machinery, or something else entirely. Drop a comment down below and tell me about it. I'd genuinely like to hear what you've managed to save from the scrap heap. Getting the HD6 home was a battle in itself. It was a 10-ton declaration of his stubbornness, and the county road was his parade ground. He'd borrowed a tandem axle lowboy from Old Man Hemlock, a retired farmer who had a soft spot for lost causes. The trailer itself was a relic, with weathered oak planks and tires that were more bald than not. The real problem was the prime mover. All Jed had was the Oliver 1650. With its 6-cylinder Waukesha diesel, it was a strong tractor for its day, rated at about 70 horsepower. Pulling 10 tons of dead weight on a heavy trailer was asking for a miracle. He spent the better part of a morning just getting the dozer loaded. The winch was frozen solid, so he couldn't pull it on. Instead, he used a pair of heavy-duty come-alongs, anchored to the front of the trailer. It was agonizingly slow work. Click, clack, the piles would catch, and the dozer would groan and scrape forward an inch. The steel cable creaked under the immense strain, shedding tiny sharp strands that pricked his leather gloves. Frank Miller drove by in his shiny Ford F-250, slowed down just long enough to shake his head in theatrical pity, and then sped off, kicking up a rooster tail of mud. Jed just ignored him, wiped the rain from his face, and kept cranking. By noon, the beast was chained down. He used every heavy chain he owned, crisscrossing them over the tracks and the frame, tightening them with load binders until the handles groaned in protest. The trip home was only 4 miles, but it felt like 100. He put the Oliver in its lowest gear and eased out the clutch. The engine bellowed, black smoke pouring from the stack as the big tractor strained against the load. The tires dug into the soft shoulder of the road before finally grabbing hold. He crept along at a walking pace, the whole rig groaning and swaying. Every culvert, every small rise in the road was a new mountain to climb. The Oliver's temperature gauge climbed steadily into the red. Jed had the cab heater blasting on full, not for warmth, but to pull a little extra heat off the engine through the heater core. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold air. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him as he passed their farms. He saw curtains twitch in windows and men stop their work in the barnyard to stare at the slow, pathetic procession. They weren't just looking at a man hauling junk. They were looking at a man they thought was finished. A man clinging to the past while they were all racing toward the future. He finally pulled into his own lane just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the bruised purple clouds with streaks of orange. The lane was soft, and the trailer tires immediately sank to their axles. It was stuck. There was no getting it any further. It would have to sit there, 100 yards from the barn, until the ground froze solid. It was another small public humiliation. That night, his wife, Sarah, looked out the kitchen window at the dark shape silhouetted against the dying light. "Jed, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with worry. "We don't have the money for a big repair bill if you can't fix it yourself." Jed came up behind her and put his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He smelled of diesel and wet steel. "I can fix it, Sarah. It's just iron and oil. It's got a Detroit in it. They're simple engines, loud and leaky but simple. It'll take time is all." "Time is one thing we have," she said, leaning back against him. "Money is another." The first step was to see just how dead the engine was. For the next 2 weeks, through biting November winds, Jed worked on the Dozer right where it sat in the lane. He started by pulling the injectors, a messy job that left his hands soaked in old diesel fuel. He peered down into the cylinders with a flashlight. 2 of them, the front and back, showed the telltale signs of rust. Water had trickled down the exhaust and found its way through an open valve. He poured a coffee can full of his own secret sauce down each cylinder, a 50-50 mix of acetone and automatic transmission fluid. It was an old-timer's trick for breaking loose rusted parts, something his father had taught him. He let it sit for a week, reapplying the mixture every day, hoping it would creep down past the piston rings. The real test came the following Saturday. He put a long 4-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt at the front of the engine. He put all his weight on it. Nothing. The engine was as solid as a block of granite. He slipped a 6-foot length of heavy steel pipe over the handle of the breaker bar, a cheetah pipe. He braced his feet against the Dozer's track frame and pulled again. The pipe bowed, the steel groaning under the strain. He could feel the muscles in his back and shoulders screaming in protest. And then, with a sound like a rifle shot, something gave. For a heart-stopping second, he thought he'd snapped the crankshaft. But then he saw it. The crank had moved, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. It wasn't much, but it wasn't zero. Hope, warm and bright, flared in his chest. For the rest of the day, he worked the engine back and forth, a fraction of an inch at a time. Each movement was a victory, accompanied by the grating sound of rust breaking its hold. By dusk, he could turn the engine over a full revolution. It was stiff and rough, but it moved. The next day, he went into town to the Napa store for gaskets and filters. The place was a local institution, run by a man named Earl, who was older than dirt and knew every part number for every tractor made since the Great Depression. The air inside was thick with the smell of rubber, oil, and old cardboard. Jed laid the old brittle head gasket on the counter. "Earl, I need a head gasket set for a Detroit 371 out of an old Alice HD6. Earl peered at it over his spectacles. "Haven't seen one of these in a coon's age," he mumbled, shuffling off toward the back room where dusty catalogues lined the shelves. "Still trying to bring that old girl back from the dead, are ya?" "Still trying," Jed confirmed. The bell over the door jingled, and in walked Frank Miller. He strode to the counter like he owned the place, slapping down a list. "Earl, I need 5 cases of High Guard, a dozen hydraulic filters for a 4440, and see if you can get me a new radio for the cab. The one I got only gets AM. He glanced over and saw Jed. Well, buying a 10-cent gasket for your $10 tractor stone. You know, for what you'll spend in time on that thing, you could get a real job and make a down payment on some decent equipment." Jed met his gaze. "I like my job, Frank, and I like my equipment. It's paid for." Miller scoffed. "Paid for and worthless. You can't farm 120 acres with a Farmall M and expect to get anywhere. This is 1978, not 1948. The game has changed. You gotta grow. Leverage your assets. That's what the bank is for." "The bank is a tool, Frank," Earl called out from the back room, his voice muffled. "And like any tool, it can cut the man who's holding it." Miller just laughed. "You old-timers are all the same, scared of progress. You watch. While Jed's out there skinning his knuckles on that pile of rust, I'll be buying the land right out from under him." He paid for his oil, gave Jed one last condescending look, and walked out. Jed stood there for a moment, his jaw set like stone. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. What he felt was a cold, hard resolve. Miller could have his new tractors and his bank loans. Jed had his hands, his knowledge, and a 10-ton pile of iron that was slowly, painfully coming back to life. The turn of the decade brought with it a strange and dangerous fever. By 1979 and into 1980, the price of corn and soybeans shot into the stratosphere. Russian grain deals, rampant inflation, and a weak dollar created a perfect storm of agricultural prosperity. Land values doubled, then tripled. A farmer could go to bed with a net worth of $100,000 and wake up a paper millionaire. The mantra from the universities and the banks was hammered home at every coffee shop and feed mill: get big or get out. Debt was no longer a chain, it was leverage, a smart business tool. Interest rates were climbing, hitting 10, then 12, then 15%, but nobody seemed to care. With land appreciating at 20% a year, borrowing money seemed like a surefire bet. Frank Miller was the king of this new era. He was the first in the county to trade up to the brand new John Deere 8640, a monstrous 8-wheeled articulated 4-wheel drive that could pull a 12-bottom plow and work around the clock. He bought the 80 acres bordering Jed's place to the north, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers gasp. He built a massive Butler machine shed, a gleaming monument of steel that dwarfed his house, and installed a new grain leg and drying system that could handle tens of thousands of bushels. He was featured in the State Farming magazine, standing in front of his new equipment, a confident smile on his face, talking about expansion and cash flow. To everyone, he was the model of success, the man who had figured out the new rules of the game. Meanwhile, Jed Stone was an island of the past in an ocean of progress. He farmed his 120 acres the same way he always had. He watched the price of land skyrocket and did nothing. He heard the talk in town and ignored it. His neighbors, even the ones who had once respected his quiet competence, started to look at him with a mixture of pity and scorn. He was the man who was being left behind. His son, young David, came home from school one day with his head down. A kid had told him his dad was too poor to buy a new tractor. Jed spent that winter, the winter of 1980, in his barn. The HD6 was finally inside, pulled in on the frozen ground. The Detroit engine was completely disassembled, its parts laid out in neat rows on his workbench. The block was sound, but the cylinder liners were scored and the pistons were pitted. He couldn't afford a full rebuild kit, so he did it the hard way. He found a used set of liners at a salvage yard 2 counties over, trading a cord of firewood for them. He spent weeks honing them by hand, using a drill-powered hone and meticulously checking the tolerances with a micrometer until they were perfect. He ordered new rings and bearings from Earl, paying in cash. He worked by the light of a single bare bulb, the silence of the winter nights broken only by the scrape of a file or the click of a wrench. The smell of solvent and steel filled the air. He cleaned every bolt, chased every thread, and checked every surface with a straight edge. It was a slow, meditative process. While Frank Miller was on the phone with his broker and his banker, Jed was learning the soul of his machine. He found a hairline crack in the exhaust manifold and spent an entire Saturday patiently V'ing it out with a grinder and filling it with nickel rod, preheating and post-heating the cast iron with a torch to keep it from cracking again. By the spring of 1981, it was ready. He had reassembled the engine piece by piece, torquing every bolt to spec from a tattered service manual he'd bought for $2. He painted the engine block the correct alpine green, a small act of pride. The day he was ready to start it, Sarah and David came out to the barn to watch. Jed had bled the fuel system and checked the oil. He climbed onto the steel seat, took a deep breath, and hit the starter button. The starter motor groaned, turning the big engine over slowly. 1 revolution. 2. Then a single cylinder fired, sending a puff of white smoke out of the straight pipe exhaust. Another cylinder caught, and another. The slow chug-a-chug turned into a ragged, sputtering roar, and then all 3 cylinders caught in unison, and the little Detroit diesel exploded into life. It wasn't a smooth, quiet rumble like Miller's new John Deere's. It was a raw, deafening 2-stroke diesel scream, a sound that rattled the windows of the barn and shook the very ground. A thick cloud of blue and black smoke billowed out, chasing the chickens out of the yard and making David cough and laugh at the same time. Jed's face split into a rare, wide grin. The sound was brutal, obnoxious, and glorious. It was the sound of victory. He spent the next few months finishing the rest. He replaced the worn-out pins and bushings in the blade linkage, a brutal job involving torches and a 20-pound sledgehammer. He welded new plates onto the track pads and painstakingly adjusted the track tension. By summer, the HD6 was no longer a pile of rust. It was a fully functional, if ugly, bulldozer. He put it to work immediately. For years, a deep gully had been eating its way into his best bottom-land field, stealing 5 or 6 acres of prime soil. He could never afford to hire a contractor to fix it. Now he didn't have to. Day after day, through the heat of July, Jed was on the dozer. The machine was loud, hot, and uncomfortable. It had no cab, and the sun beat down on him relentlessly. But as he worked, he felt a deep satisfaction. With each pass, he pushed tons of earth, slowly but surely filling the gully, reshaping his land with his own 2 hands and a machine he had resurrected from the grave. One evening, as he was finishing up, Frank Miller pulled his truck up to the edge of the field. He got out and watched for a few minutes, a strange look on his face. The dozer, for all its noise and smoke, was doing the job. "Still playing with your toys, I see," Miller shouted over the engine's roar. Jed throttled the engine down to an idle and wiped the sweat from his brow with a greasy hand. "Just reclaiming some land." "You know," Miller said, a condescending tone in his voice, "I just signed the papers on the old Henderson place. All 240 acres of it. Got a hell of a deal from the bank." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. "That gives me a solid block, clear to the river. You're going to be surrounded, Jed. A little island of the past." Jed looked at Miller. He looked at his new truck, his clean clothes, and the easy confidence of a man who believed his own press. Then he looked back at the acres of rich black soil he had just saved, land his grandfather had cleared with mules. "Good for you, Frank," he said quietly. He throttled the old Detroit back up to a scream, drowning out any possible reply. He pushed the lever forward, dropped the blade, and went back to work. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the newly healed land, Jed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. On the radio in the barn that night, he heard the news. The Federal Reserve, under a man named Paul Volcker, had just raised the prime interest rate to over 20% in a desperate last-ditch effort to kill inflation. The announcer's voice was grim. Frank Miller had just borrowed millions of dollars. Jed had just spent his last $10 on a pile of scrap. A storm was coming, a financial hurricane the likes of which no one had ever seen. And Jed Stone, standing alone on his small debt-free island, was the only one in the county who seemed to notice the sky was turning black. The prosperity of 1981 was a fever dream, and the summer of 1982 was the harsh, sweat-soaked awakening. The sky turned a metallic, unforgiving blue and stayed that way. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a relentless sun baked the fields, and a hot, dry wind out of the southwest stole what little moisture remained. The corn, which had stood so proud and green in June, began to curl its leaves inward during the day. A desperate botanical prayer for a drink it would not receive. The soybeans, normally a lush canopy of green, turned a sickly yellow, their pods thin and underdeveloped. For Jedediah Stone, the drought was a hardship. For Frank Miller, it was the beginning of the end. Jed watched his own crops suffer, his heart aching with the quiet grief only a farmer knows. But his costs were low. The old Farmall M sipped fuel, and the Oliver, used only for heavy tillage in the spring and fall, sat silent in the shed. His biggest expense was property tax. The HD6 became his salvation. The gully he had filled was now a wide, grassed waterway, holding what little rain did fall and preventing his topsoil from washing away. He spent the hottest part of the summer using the dozer to clear a tangled, overgrown fence row on his southern border, pushing out 30 years of hedge trees and scrub brush. The work was brutal, but for the cost of diesel fuel and his own sweat, he was gaining another 3 acres of tillable land. He was adding value, not debt. Frank Miller was living a different reality. His 1,000 acres were 1,000 thirsty mouths to feed, and his line of credit was a ravenous beast that demanded payment regardless of the weather. His operating loan for that year alone was more than Jed's entire farm was worth. He had bet everything on high yields and high prices, and the sky had called his bluff. The first visible crack appeared in late July. Miller was trying to cultivate his sprawling fields of soybeans with his new John Deere 4440, trying to break up the hard-baked crust to conserve moisture. The tractor, barely 3 years old, was a marvel of technology with its power-shift transmission and hydraulic everything. It was also complex. One afternoon, as he was working the field that bordered Jed's place, the tractor stopped dead. A high-pitched whine from underneath the cab was followed by a sickening clunk, and then silence. Jed was on his HD6 nearby and saw the whole thing. He watched as Miller climbed out of the air-conditioned cab, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Jed idled the Dozer down and walked over. "Trouble, Frank?" Miller kicked one of the huge rear tires, the dust puffing up around his clean boots. "Transmission. Something in the planetary pack let go, I think. Damn thing won't move an inch." He stared at the silent green giant as if it had personally betrayed him. "That's a $10,000 repair if I'm lucky. And I'll have to get the dealer mechanic out here from 60 miles away. Be down for a week at least. A week of downtime in a critical season, plus a repair bill that would buy a good used tractor outright." Jed nodded slowly. "That's tough." He looked back at his own machine, the loud, simple Dozer. Its transmission was a set of heavy gears and clutches, something he could fix with a wrench and a chain hoist if it ever failed. "Tough doesn't begin to cover it," Miller spat, his usual confidence gone, replaced by a raw, frayed anger. "Everything's got to be so damn complicated now, a computer chip to tell you the filter is dirty, a dozen hydraulic lines where two would do. You pay for all that comfort, and when it breaks, you pay all over again." He glanced at the HD6, its faded yellow paint and exposed engine looking primitive, almost laughable in comparison to his sleek green machine. But it was running, and it was working. For the first time, Jed saw not contempt in Miller's eyes, but a flicker of something else, a desperate, unwilling envy. The drought broke in late August with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what little corn was left. The harvest was a disaster across the county. Yields were cut in half. To make matters worse, the global grain markets, once a farmer's best friend, turned traitor. The Russian grain embargo was lifted, flooding the market with sellers, and a bumper crop in South America sent prices tumbling. The double blow of low yields and low prices was a knockout punch for anyone who was overextended. The talk at the coffee shop turned grim. Men who had been bragging about their new four-wheel drives a year ago now spoke in hushed tones about restructuring loans and selling off breeding stock. The word foreclosure, once whispered only in reference to the Great Depression, began to enter everyday conversation. Frank Miller stopped coming to the coffee shop altogether. The lights in his new machine shed, which had once burned late into the night, were often dark. The cracks in his empire were widening into chasms, and the ground beneath his feet was beginning to give way. The winter of 1983 was bleak and cold, but the real blizzard was economic. The Federal Reserve held firm, keeping interest rates brutally high. Land that had been valued at $3,000 an acre 2 years prior now couldn't find a buyer at $1,500. For farmers like Frank Miller, whose entire financial structure was built on the inflated value of their land, it was a death spiral. His collateral was worth half of what he owed against it. The bank, which had once courted him with easy credit and friendly smiles, now sent letters filled with cold, legal language. His variable rate loans, tied to the prime rate, were devouring him alive. The interest payments alone were more than he could ever hope to gross in a year. The end came, as it so often did, with a notice tacked to the door of the county courthouse, an auction. The entire Frank Miller farming operation, land, equipment, everything. It was scheduled for a bitter cold Saturday in March of 1984. The day of the auction was a mirror image of the Henderson sale nearly 6 years earlier, but colder and more desperate. The crowd was larger, drawn by the sheer scale of the collapse. This wasn't a small, marginal farm going under, this was the king of the county, the man who had done everything the experts had told him to do. If it could happen to Frank Miller, it could happen to anyone. The fear was a palpable thing, thick as the frozen breath that hung in the air. Jed was there, standing near the back, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't there to gloat, he was there to bear witness, just as before. He saw Miller's new house, the big machine shed, and the rows of gleaming late-model John Deere equipment. The 8640 articulated tractor, the two 4440s, the big combine with its corn and bean heads lined up neatly beside it. It was a textbook example of a modern, successful farm, and it was all for sale. The auctioneer started with the equipment. The bidding was slow, almost funereal. The big 8640, which Miller had paid over $100,000 for, struggled to get a bid of $30,000. Men who needed the tractor, men who could use it, stood with their hands in their pockets. They had no money. The banks weren't lending. The few who were buying were bottom feeders from out of state, picking the bones of a dying industry. Jed watched as piece by piece, Miller's dream was dismantled and sold for a fraction of its worth. He saw Frank standing by the house with his wife, her face pale and drawn, his own expression hollowed out, as if he were watching a stranger's life fall apart. The confident, swaggering man was gone, replaced by a ghost. When the equipment was gone, they sold the land. They started with the outlying parcels. The Henderson place Miller had bought was the first to go. It sold for a third of what he had paid for it. Then came the 80-acre parcel that bordered Jed's farm, the one Miller had bragged about buying. "All right, folks, here's a prime piece of ground," the auctioneer chanted, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. 80 acres, good black dirt. Who'll start the bidding at $1,000 an acre? Silence. $1,000 an acre was still too rich for most. 900? Can I get 900? Jed felt a nudge at his elbow. It was old man Hemlock. "You thinking about it, son?" he whispered. Jed hadn't been. His farm was small, but it was manageable. He had a little money saved, cash from the custom Dozer work he had been doing for the last 2 years, but not enough to get into a bidding war. "I can't afford it," Jed said quietly. "The bank that holds my note is sitting right over there," the auctioneer pleaded, pointing to a man in a suit who looked profoundly uncomfortable. "They're prepared to be reasonable on financing for a qualified buyer." Another long, cold silence. The idea of taking on new debt, even for good land at a bargain price, was terrifying to everyone present. Then Jed spoke, his voice clear in the cold air. 600. Every head turned. $600 an acre. It was a low bid, almost an insult. But it was a bid. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I've got 600 from Jed Stone, $600 an acre. Now who'll give me 650? He looked around the crowd. No one moved. They looked at Jed, then back at the auctioneer. They knew Jed. They knew he didn't owe a dime. They knew his bid was solid. It was cash. In 1984, cash was king, and Jed was one of the few who had any. 600 going once, the auctioneer said, his gaze sweeping the crowd one last time. Going twice? Sold. For $600 an acre to Jedediah Stone. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. Jed Stone, the man with the old tractors and the $10 Dozer, had just bought Frank Miller's land. Jed didn't look at Miller. He just walked to the clerk's table to sign the papers, his face unreadable. He had survived. And in this new, harsh world, survival was the only kind of success that mattered. The weeks after the auction were a somber time in the county. The Miller sale was a wound that wouldn't close, a constant reminder of how quickly fortunes could turn. Frank and his family managed to hold on to their house and the 40 acres it sat on. But the rest was gone. The bank had taken a massive loss, and the empire Frank had built was nothing but a memory. One evening in late April, as Jed was getting his old Farmall M ready for planting, he saw a pickup truck pull into his lane. It was Frank Miller's. Jed shut the tractor off, the sudden silence broken by the chirping of crickets. He wiped his hands on a rag as Frank walked toward him, his steps slow and heavy. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 months. "Jed," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't meet Jed's eyes, instead staring at the intricate casting of the Farmall's transmission housing. "Frank," Jed replied, waiting, I just wanted to say—" "Thank you," Frank stammered. Jed was confused. For what? For buying that 80, at the sale. Frank finally looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that went beyond money. "If one of those out-of-state vultures had gotten it, I don't know. It just would have felt worse. At least it's with a neighbor, someone who will take care of it." Jed nodded. He understood. It was about more than land. It was about stewardship, about a connection that went deeper than a deed. "The thing is, Jed," Frank continued, his voice cracking slightly, "I don't know what to do. I've still got the house, but I've got nothing to farm with. I've been looking for work in town. Nobody's hiring. I'm broke." The admission hung in the air between them, a final, painful surrender of his pride. Jed looked at this man, his rival, the one who had mocked him and his old ways. He saw not an enemy, but a fellow farmer who was drowning. He thought of his father's words, not about debt, but about community. "A neighbor's trouble is your trouble, whether you want it to be or not." "I need to clear out that old fence row on the south side of that 80, Jed said, his tone practical, matter-of-fact. "The one that borders the creek. It's a mess of rock and hedge trees. I was going to do it myself with the dozer, but it's planting season." He paused. "It's a big job. I could use a hand, and I'll need someone to run the planter on that new ground while I'm working my own. I'll pay you a fair wage." Frank stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He was being offered a job by the man who had bought his land. It was charity, but it was offered in the guise of work, a way for him to keep his dignity. Tears welled up in Frank's eyes, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. Okay, Jed, okay. Thank you." And so an unlikely partnership was born. That spring, Frank Miller, the man who had once commanded a fleet of new John Deeres, found himself sitting on the simple steel seat of Jed's Farmall M, planting corn. And Jed, on his roaring HD6, spent his days clearing the fence row, the old Detroit diesel screaming as he pushed over trees and shoved aside generations of fieldstone. They worked on opposite ends of the 80 acres, two men brought together by failure and forgiveness. The community watched, and the perspective began to shift. They saw Jed not as a stubborn relic of the past, but as a man of quiet wisdom. They saw his debt-free operation not as a lack of ambition, but as a fortress of stability in a world of chaos. Men started stopping by Jed's shop again, not to mock, but to ask for help. "Jed, my old 4020 threw a rod. The dealer wants a fortune for a new short block. You know where I might find a used one? Jed, the clutch is out on my combine. Any chance you could give me a hand? I can't afford the shop rate." Jed always helped. He never charged for his time, only asking for help in his own fields in return. His farm became a hub of the old ways: barter, cooperation, and mutual support. He was rebuilding not just his own farm, but the very fabric of the community that the financial crisis had torn apart. Years passed. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip, prices stabilized, and the rains returned. Jed and Sarah raised their son, David, on the now 200-acre farm. Jed never got big. He bought a slightly newer Oliver tractor, a 1755, but he paid cash for it. The Farmall M was still used for lighter duties, and in the back of the machine shed, the Alice Chalmers HD6 still sat, its yellow paint faded, its engine stained with oil, but always ready to work. Frank Miller eventually found his footing. He took a job managing the local co-op, his knowledge of modern farming practices proving invaluable. He and Jed became friends, a quiet, respectful friendship forged in the crucible of hardship. They never spoke of the auction, but the understanding was always there between them. One crisp autumn afternoon, when David was 16, Jed found him in the shop, staring at the old dozer. "What's on your mind?" Jed asked. "Dad," David said, running a hand over the cold steel of the blade. "Why do we keep this old thing? It's loud, it's slow, it leaks oil everywhere. We could get a newer one." Jed smiled. He walked over and stood next to his son, placing a hand on the massive track frame. "This machine," he began, his voice soft, "is the most important thing on this farm. It's more than just iron. It's a lesson." He told David the whole story: the Henderson auction, the $10 bid, the laughter from the crowd. He told him about Frank Miller, about the easy credit and the new tractors, about the drought and the crash. He explained how this 10-ton pile of scrap, brought back to life with his own two hands, had allowed them to survive when everything around them was collapsing. "Your grandfather taught me that debt is a chain you can't see," Jed said, looking his son in the eye. "But this machine taught me something more. It taught me the difference between what something costs and what it's worth. We live in a world that's always trying to sell you something new, something better, something you have to borrow money to get. They want you to trade in your old tools before you've even learned how to fix them. He patted the Dozer's fender. This old girl doesn't have a radio or air conditioning, but she's honest. Every part on her was made to be fixed, not thrown away. She taught me that self-reliance is the only real wealth. She helped us buy the land your children will one day farm. She cost me $10, David, but she's worth everything we have. David looked from his father's worn, calloused hands to the hulking, ancient machine. He finally understood. It wasn't a relic, it was a monument. It was a testament to a different way of thinking, a philosophy of patience, skill, and quiet resilience. It was the heart of their farm, a 10-ton anchor that had held them fast in the storm. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that as long as it stood in their shed, the Stone family would always remember the lesson it had taught them.